When you think of the word immigrant, it probably calls to mind a very specific experience, one that is harrowing and despondent, and maybe even involves some significant emotional trauma. Maybe it's just me, but I've always wondered what was so divisive about immigration. Borders have historically been markers of political institutions, and over the course of history have changed to reflect significant cross cultural transformations. Yet, there's an almost apocalyptic paranoia associated with border crossing, with the threat of increased domestic terrorism, economic downfall, and cultural extinction. But that's not what immigration is really all about, is it? The immigration story is closer to a Hollywood action film than a long form non-fiction program, even though it can feel like this too when discussions of the issue are bogged down with legal jargon, bureaucracy, and politics. The partisan coverage of immigration waters down the issue and even taking meaning out of the word itself. Officially, the International Organization for Migration, IOM, defines an immigrant as a non national person who is moving into a country for the purpose of settlement. But this episode is less about the logistics of moving into a new country, and assimilating with the culture. No, this episode will be discussing the often overlooked perspectives of immigrants, the emotional and physical costs, and what they stand to lose in a sea of skewed representation. So, if you've ever wondered, what is the immigrant experience really like? And are the depictions we see in the media accurate? Well, actually, I Googled it, so you don't have to. Let's get into it. To understand the West's outlook on immigration, one must take into consideration the role imperialism has placed in building our international community as we know it. Europe's colonial presence over the majority of the world left room for many of the systems to be defined and framed in Eurocentric terms, with a vastly imbalanced power structure. Many countries in the global south generated wealth for their European custodians, even after slavery. And colonization ended with financial and trade agreements that effectively left the newly minted governments dependent on their oppressors to survive. This, however, was a double edged sword, as the problems that arose out of the different kingdoms' amalgamations resulted in, widespread poverty and civil conflicts, funded by the same European superpowers who were fighting in proxy wars amongst themselves. This is the pretext that surrounds the word today. Despite the fact that immigration has occurred for centuries and has always been crucial to human survival, the topic has been hotly debated over the course of history, but was most significantly defined in 2001 after the terrorist attack on the World Trade Center in New York. The aftermath of the tragedy saw a severe response against the nation states of the assailants, an increase in xenophobia and distrust of foreigners, as well as significant changes to immigration policies and protocols after it was discovered that many of the assailants had overstayed their student visas. Whether or not that's true, we might never know. The legal framework around immigration policy has thus been the main narrative presented in the media, with more coverage on illegal border crossings and undocumented immigrants. A study on the effect the Chilean media had on the public's perception of immigrants describes the relationship between mass media and the population, illustrating opportunities for acculturation through connection. From a cultural perspective, the mass media as a social institution has a role in community formation, reaffirming ties and sharing common values. These practices could increase migrants' sense of belonging, providing a common language and references, as well as patterns, social orientations, and beliefs that allow coexistence in society. However, it can also encourage the contrary, such as discrimination, xenophobia, and exclusion. The first set of practices contribute to facilitating social integration, whereas the latter set of practices undermine the process of social integration. If the news is understood to be a respected institution that not just represents our society, but reflects our outlook, reality, and belief systems, then its ethical obligations cannot be overstated. As a primary source of information for the public, it serves as a starting point for many social constructs, especially with regards to foreigners. The media coverage of immigration is typically centered around violence and crime. and is usually designed to elicit specific responses to different kinds or categories of immigrants, and often for political agendas. The Washington Post compiled over 300 images from immigration stories that ran from the year 2000 to 2010 and found that there was an overarching perpetuation of what the Post describes as the Latino threat. We found images of illegality and criminality at a rate far higher than actually occurs in the US's immigrant population. For instance, while less than a quarter of immigrants in the US are unauthorized, 54% of the images we analyzed portrayed undocumented immigrants, including photographs of immigrants illegally crossing the border or in custody of immigration officials. Immigrants were frequently portrayed in detention facilities, implying criminality. That's despite research showing that immigrants, both those here legally and those who are undocumented, are less likely to commit crimes. In comparison, the facts of immigration are less sensational. The hypervisibility of Latino males in handcuffs and visuals of the US-Mexico border represent only a small fraction of this demographic, as the Post reports higher numbers of female immigrants, 49% as of 2010, and higher rates of immigration among other ethnic groups in the same time period. There is no doubt that our entertainment channels tend to be an extension of the news. With the majority of networks and production studios being owned by the same four companies, it isn't hard to see how messages are reinforced in different channels and spheres, despite them claiming or appearing to have little to no political involvement. Even without the issue of media ownership and who really has control of the mass media, we still face problems that stem from bias or agenda-based coverage of important topics. Once these discussions have been opened up at the national or even international level, the dominant sides of the argument will ultimately be packaged and delivered non-stop to an unsuspecting audience through the 24-hour news cycle. These narratives will typically be the easiest to digest and lack the nuance that would require more in-depth analysis, and most importantly, objective investigation. A good example would be the coverage of abortion rights across the US. The issue is largely framed in the lens of the religious conservatives pushing for restricted access to abortion, with liberal oppositions predicated around free will and the right to bodily autonomy. However, there is not enough news coverage of other contributing factors such as the state of welfare in the country, sex trafficking, racial and income disparities, and finally, women's health, which is an area of medicine that doesn't get the public interest of other fields and is regularly embedded in abuse and harmful misconceptions. These stories, if and when they do appear on the news, are more likely to be found on local news channels, which are typically underfunded and only have a small reach. So now that we have a clear understanding of how the headline to political agenda pipeline turns one-sided stories into beliefs that are widely accepted by the public, it's easy to see how these become solidified and reiterated through the same media outlets. Before going into my analysis of certain tropes that we see in entertainment surrounding immigration, I feel obligated to provide some context. I'm an international student from Nigeria. I'm in my senior year at the University of Kansas, and while I grew up in Nigeria, always lived there, still do, I've been overexposed to Western culture and media, primarily through American and British productions, literature, and pop culture that I was engaged with on social media. My introduction to identity politics ultimately came through these platforms because until then, my identity was always down to my ethnicity, particularly my parents' ethnicities, and the cultural idiosyncrasies of growing up fairly middle class in Abuja, the capital city of Nigeria. My definition of what it meant to be Nigerian was just that. The experiences me and my friends and classmates could relate to, and the defining moments that we all witnessed growing up in Nigeria in the early 2000s. As I got older and learned more about racial and diasporic identities, I developed an interest in seeing that representation in the media. This is how I came to identify the tropes that African people have been relegated to in the media. In the news, we see Africans as one of the following personas: starving children in rural communities, Eccentric or quirky token employees or friends that often struggle to assimilate into the culture of their host country, assuming they don't live in Africa, and are generally the comedic relief. There's also terrorists or thugs, some other kind of juvenile delinquent that is a burden to their society. International criminals running complicated fraud schemes. I know you all know about the Nigerian prince trope. And of course, there's the emaciated refugees and or survivors of systemic and severe abuse that needs to be saved by the West. There's also docile and uneducated primitives that mean well, but are grossly disenfranchised. And then finally, there's the savages. I also like to refer to this category as the Africanist radicals that pose a threat to the Eurocentric audience. Listing these off, you might not recognize or remember these portrayals in some of the things you've seen or read. So let me help you jog your memory.
There isn't another ambulance. What do you mean there's no other ambulance? What do you mean? Fucking move! Fucking find me an ambulance! Find me an ambulance! ابغى يعرف كيفاش غيدير باش يخرج المرة ديالهم. قول ليه اللي قالوا لي السفارة ديالهم هي اللي مكلفة بهذا الشيء. Your embassy with.The. What can my embassy do? This is your fucked up country. It's your responsibility. You do something. السفارة ديالكم هي اللي حبسوا الامبيلانس وقالوا لي غادي يصيفطوا واحد الهليكوبتر ديالهم ولكن كاينين جماعة. Behold, Simi, life, real life, a thing that we have been denied for far too long. Good morning, my neighbors! Hey, fuck you! Yes! Yes! Fuck you too!
What are you doing? Dia! Young babe, what are you doing? Bella Dia Avanti of the proud Mende tribe. You're a good boy.
Cockroaches in your trunk. No. There's political refugees under UN sanction. Where's the money? I know what your food. I want your money. Well, it says maintain camera footage. Hold on a second. Go to the side. $10 million side. $10 million. بمقلة هو عادي. مركبكم حنوزوها دكتوره. يا موسى تاخذوه يا العمل كل عيال يا صاحب تاخذوه $10 million وين خلاص انا سائل وما I'm Dr. Nicholas Garrigan. I work at medical compound in Magambo. I'm a doctor.
You are British.
Well, I'm Scottish. Yeah, I'm Scottish.
Scottish?
Yeah.
Why didn't you say so? I fought with the Scots against the Mau. Great soldiers. Very brave. And good people. Completely. Let me tell you, if I could be anything instead of a Ugandan, I would be a Scot.
Like, really? Really?
Except for the red hair, which I'm sure is attractive to your women, but which we Africans, we find this quite disgusting.
But my family's totally normal, except for the fact that both my parents are research zoologists and we spent the last 12 years in Africa. I had a great life, but then my mom got offered tenure at Northwestern University. So it was goodbye Africa and hello high school. I'm okay, sorry. I'll be careful.
best? This is a middle-aged Nigerian man who wants your money or your kidney.
You think I'm being catfished?
Absolutely. I'm trusting to a fault, and even I know this screams Nigerian scam.
Yeah, have you ever FaceTimed Kirsten?
No, but only because she's got spotty wireless.
Yikes.
So, this is how we're gonna get to the bottom of this. Next time you chat, say something that no geek would agree with.
Greedo shot first, Lost Finale killed it, Val Kilmer was the best Batman.
You don't have to convince us you're a geek. We know. Just save it for Kirsten.
AKA Babatunde Adebayo.
These are just films and shows that I remember, but I promise you there are many more. Especially since this list doesn't include the pervasive ads paid for by multi-million-dollar non-profits hoping to convince you to volunteer to save the African babies. Now, before you say it, I know. The writers and producers don't intend to limit their audience's understanding of Africans, immigrants, or otherwise. And I know that these tropes are not meant to insult or ridicule the subjects. The argument for portrayals like this is that in some cases, mostly in comedies like Mean Girls, it is produced and or written as satire with the clear intent to highlight and generate conversations about why we think this way about others. However, focusing on this same point rather than pointing out the very clear discrepancies in the research the producers have done is actually really unproductive. Assuming that there are only good intentions involved is failing to look deeper at what these films and TV shows are actually achieving when they push out these narratives time and time again. I'll give an example. In 2009, Michelle Martin, former host of NPR's Tell Me More, which was a radio talk show that aired from 2007 to 2014, sat down with Armin White, then chairman of the New York Film Critics Circle, and Eric Deggans, TV and media critic for the St. Petersburg Times, to discuss controversial connections the characters of two popular movies had to racial and gender-based stereotypes. Bruno, a film developed by Sacha Baron Cohen, which is about a gay Austrian fashion journalist. This clip is from the portion of their interview where they discuss whether or not the character is funny or offensive.
Armin, funny or offensive?
What he is he's a form of ambush artist, and I find that particularly offensive. Whether his subject is left wing or right wing politics, whether it's Asian or rather Muslim politics, or whether it's gay politics, I think he's just an offensive opportunist comic.
Eric, funny or offensive?
What's weird about it is it could be both. It could be funny and offensive. And in a weird way, that's the point. What is different to me about Bruno, and I will allow that I have not seen the film. I've only seen clips of it. What is interesting to me about this film is that the whole point of this character and the whole point of what Sacha Baron Cohen is doing with the character is to get in people's faces with the most offensive stereotypes about gay people that he can embody in one character, and then put them into situations where he thinks that it might start trouble with people who aren't aware of what he's doing. And in that fission, in that reaction, in that combustibility, I think he's hoping to get both humor, and he's also hoping to reveal something about the people that he's interacting with. What he's done is create a really offensive character and just kind of put him in these situations that are not funny and don't reveal anything.
I think the problem with films like Bruno is that their messaging makes them fall short. The acceptance of this idea that we live in a world where oppression and bias are behind us has emboldened the entertainment industry to capitalize on these problems at the expense of the people who have been harmed. We're holding on to this idea that colonization is history, and just that, and choosing to ignore the historical atrocities that led to many of the ongoing crises these countries face in order to disguise ongoing systems of abuse and exploitation. Nevertheless, we more often see movies and TV shows that perpetuate the same ignorance even while dismantling it. Modern Family is a good example. And for the years that it aired, it portrayed Sofia Vergara's character as the stereotypical spicy Latina, who is over-sexualized, amiable, and endearingly ignorant of social norms and cues in the US. At the same time, the show does give her character depth and forces the audience to acknowledge the struggles that women like her face. especially in this famous scene where she talks about her frustrations with not being able to express herself in English.
Did you sign something so that Manny could switch to French?
I did.
You knew that I wanted him to learn Spanish.
I also know you can't force a kid to be interested in something that he's not. That's why I have a picture of Mitchell on his prom date shaking hands.
It would be nice for someone to care what I think for a change.
You should also know that I hired a new swimming instructor, but don't worry. She's got the same broad shoulders plus a mustache.
So all this is because you're jealous? I can't believe that you're being so what is the word? Selfish, pig-headed.
Really?
Her words, not mine. Do you know how frustrating it is to have to translate everything in my head before I say it? To have people laugh in my face because I'm struggling to find the words? You should try talking in my shoes from 1 mile.
I think you meant...
I know what I meant to mean. Do you even know how smart I am in Spanish? Of course you don't. For once, it would be nice to speak to someone in my own language, in my own home. Whatever the Spanish word is for women, am I right?
Despite clearly articulating some of the harsh realities of living as an immigrant in another country, particularly the US, the scene ends with the dismissive dig made by Manny, her son, which characterizes her experience in a sexist and insensitive outlook, thus taking away from the seriousness of the scene. Now, I might get some backlash for this, and I might have to defend my next example, which is Black Panther. I know, this was a tough one to reckon with, and I want to preface this by saying that the Black Panther movies have been monumental in breaking down the dark continent myth that kept Africa separated from the rest of the world. The movie really opened up barriers not just for African and Black diaspora actors and filmmakers, but really showed how the world can come together over beautifully done representation in film and negate the idea that Black talent doesn't do well in the box office. I also want to emphasize that watching this as a person who grew up within the continent and watching it amongst my peers, my people, was not an experience that was lost on me. When you're used to seeing yourself in only one way, you get surprised by how refreshing it is to see more admirable and honest representation of who you are, but most importantly, who you could be. But Marvel isn't real. Black Panther is a superhero movie centered around a reclusive African country that has evaded colonization and all the imperial efforts of the West due to its superior technological and intellectual advancement. All thanks to this almost mythical substance called vibranium. It's described as the strongest metal in the Marvelverse, and in addition to being basically indestructible, it can produce a myriad of lethal weapons. Does that remind you of anything? Can you guess what country in the world possesses the largest reserves of coltan and has $24 trillion worth of untapped mineral deposits? Yeah, if you guessed Congo, you're right. The Democratic Republic of Congo is a very similar story to what we see represented in Black Panther, though on opposing ends of what could have been. To save you the detour of a journey through time, I'll just give the key differences. Congo, unlike Wakanda, was colonized by Belgium under King Leopold II from 1885 to 1908 and remained a colony after Leopold's reign ended until it gained its independence in 1960. The DRC never fully recovered from the brutal colonial empire and the subsequent operations in the 20th century by the US and its allies to destabilize its government. Wakanda is ruled by a monarchy and guarded by the ancestral Black Panther figure who inherits superhuman strength in order to protect their people, while Congo was plagued with a deep political and tribal division for years. Congo is unfortunately one of the world's poorest countries, and over 64% of Congolese citizens live on less than $2.15 a day. The difference in the reality of many African countries couldn't be more glaring. And this is an image that Black Panther tries to erase with its Pan-African celebration and Afrofuturistic elements, which get people excited about the continent and its people. I know I was definitely excited. I remember even because I just saw Black Panther 2, I turned to my sister and I said, wow, I wish that could have been us. I really do. Because it's so fun to see the coming together of cultural elements, cultural visuals and aesthetics, as well as this really cool, hyper futuristic vibe. And, you know, there's nothing wrong with that. It should be fun and it should exist for everyone to enjoy. But what if we need both representations, not one above the other, but side by side? Some of the pitfalls of the movie, small things that most audience members won't recognize, are not just sprinkled all over the film, but actually embedded in its well-intentioned message. As much as we all want the narrative of the Dark Continent to be retired, we don't want to sugarcoat the very real trials facing Africans, not just on the continent, but all over the world. The idea that Black excellence is so heavily imposed upon audiences in films like Black Panther, Coming to America, and Beyonce's visual album Black is King is a projection, essentially, of what the Black diaspora would want us to be, rather than standing proud in who we are. Essentially standing in our truth, because the truth is pretty dark. Don't get me wrong, there's absolutely a place for utopian African stories that can serve as a shield for the Black diaspora dealing with not just the isolation of being separated from their culture, but also the stress of living in an oppressive and, in many cases, hostile conditions in other countries. But it should be written, produced, and promoted as that, and not a story about African culture and traditions. In this way, Black Panther begins to fail the community it's based on by condensing the whole continent for easy consumption to a Western audience. It pulls different cultural traditions, aesthetics, languages, accents, music. Do I need to say more? It pulls together all these things to conjure up a fairy tale that is not for us and doesn't represent us. Lastly, and even more problematically, it's a story written from an American perspective, despite having native Wakandan main characters who are the centerpiece of the story. The plot of Black Panther revolves around the infamous diaspora wars between Africans and African Americans and peddles this message of unity across continents for the sake of global Black liberation. Now, even though hardships often build deep connections, and have done so many times in our history, oppression is just not a strong enough unifier. Let me say that again. Oppression is not a strong enough unifier. And it's even less effective against deeply entrenched colonial constructs that pit racial and ethnic minorities against one another. Basically, what I'm saying is, if race was the be-all and end-all of social interaction and the one thing standing in the way of world peace, we wouldn't have so many seemingly never-ending conflicts amongst ethnic groups all over the world. This is why saying I don't see color does absolutely nothing for marginalized groups. Even the sequel, Wakanda Forever, makes this mistake by introducing another villain from a historically oppressed community called Talucan, which borrows heavily from indigenous Mexican culture, particularly Maya. And this is a fact. This has been stated by the filmmakers involved in this project, so no, there is no assumption about where they got the ideas from. They pulled from Mayan culture specifically. This villain is hell-bent on defeating the surface people, essentially all life on Earth, which, for the sake of the story, is a symbol of Western imperialism. You can believe that if you want, and you cannot believe that, but if you are looking deep into the story and the message embedded into this film, it's pretty obvious. So, What's the problem then? The growing interest in extracting vibranium is essentially a threat to the Talokan people. And Namor, the all-powerful leader, is evidently thwarted by Shuri. Well, hold on. Spoilers. Okay, there are spoilers for Wakanda Forever. If you, for some reason, haven't seen the movie by now, I don't know what to tell you. So go see the movie. But let's get back into it. So Namor is evidently thwarted by Shuri, who overcomes her own demons to save the people of the world. The main interest that we're ultimately aligned with is, of course, America's. Wakanda's less than secret partnership with the FBI agent, that connection and partnership is the thread that keeps us as the audience bound to American interests and aligns us with their goals without ever fully reckoning with the increasing hostility towards Wakandans and, of course, the aggressive efforts to mine and extract vibranium to strengthen their military. Like, if you have seen that movie, I'm sure you probably were also asking yourself this. Why does Shuri, despite all her rage and disappointment, all the trauma that she's experienced, why does she choose to side with the Americans? Why does she resist Namor's campaign to protect his and her people? Why are the people of Wakanda threatened by the Talokan? And why are the Western governments and not the Western governments who are actively searching for supplies of vibranium to rival and even possibly attack their country? And why are both communities so intent on stopping one another when they're on the same page about the very real threat of white supremacy? What's going on? Basically, the missing piece in the Black Panther series is the African experience and perspective. But given that this is an American production and is pure entertainment, I can't really say that it failed at accomplishing what it set out to do. So, Black Panther? The jury's still out on whether or not this representation is truly accurate and representative of the people that it claims to. But, I mean, it's a great movie. On the other side of the pond, we have a similar but not quite the same situation. The influx of migrants into Europe peaked in 2015 when countries reported astronomically high numbers of asylum seekers from countries like Afghanistan, Nigeria, Pakistan, Iraq, and more. Most of these refugees were fleeing civil wars, specifically the civil war in Syria, which had at that point escalated drastically and resulted in an estimated 1.3 million asylees entering the continent, the highest number of refugee seekers in a single year since World War II. This was obviously a highly documented situation that dominated international news and global politics, especially because it coincided with a rise in radical jihadist extremism and a series of attacks that plagued Western Europe. Many political platforms that were initiated during that time frame were essentially built around immigration policies, and far-right groups stoked the hysteria with anti-immigration rhetoric, Islamophobia, and xenophobia. This is a summary of what the average person might remember from that time. And what we see here is very similar to the coverage of immigration policy in the United States. The visuals of mass groups of people likely covered in dirt and grime from just barely making their journey, running across our screens with frantic eyes and clinging onto the only possessions they could bring with them. We see images of destruction, fires from explosions, wrecked boats, tents in refugee camps, noble and conveniently white volunteers handing out tiny bags of food and manning first aid stations. These images do not generate the sympathy we think it does. And how could it? You honestly couldn't tell the difference between these scenes and a Marvel movie. Furthermore, you also have the numbers.
Almost 3,000 has drowned this year. But the total arrival figures are just astounding. Now some 500,000 and more, as we know, are coming.
So that's the latest 40 people or so arriving here, but
Thousands more have arrived on these beaches in the last few weeks, and they're now part of an elaborate smuggling system.
The hours of this cold November morning, 600 men, women and children are being evacuated from a camp in Port-de-la-Chapelle.
More than 9,000 migrants have arrived illegally by boat from Turkey, heading for mainland Europe.
Hundreds are stuck here, the Hungarian government refusing to let them board trains out of the country.
These numbers are drilled into the audience over and over again to emphasize the mass exodus that is going on and really convey how drastic this situation is. But is it maybe too drastic? Of course, 2015 was a lethal combination of conflict, violence, and terror, and there were many reasons to feel worried about the future. But when you think about who the antagonist of these stories was, you might reconsider the objectiveness that the media outlets cling on to in defense of their reporting. The fear that the news stokes is often targeted at the immigrants and further exacerbated by the far-right pundits who are not only given a platform to share inaccuracies and biased takes on the matter, but also engage in meaningless and often awkward debates on TV, distracting from the main story and burying it into this maze that political debate has apparently become. I mean, I know you're all tired of seeing people just yell at each other on your screen. You probably even stop watching because of that. And I mean, of course you would. Who cares about people adults screaming at each other on TV? As a result, we miss out on the nuance this conversation needs. Regardless of your feelings about refugees or the politics of developing nations, we can't ignore that many of these countries have colonial legacies in the global south that have stunted their growth. Belgium, for instance, recently accepted moral responsibility for the role they played in the coup and assassination of Congo's first democratically elected prime minister, which triggered civil conflicts whose effects can still be felt today. I didn't make this up. Google it, okay? They killed him. France still has many of its former colonies under its thumb through the West African franc and the Central African franc. Currencies it issues to 14 countries while holding 50% of their foreign assets in the French treasury. Germany recently and begrudgingly, might I add, apologized to Namibia for the genocide of the Ovaherero Namakwa people, though it has fallen short of the reparation demands that Namibians would like to see. The United Kingdom still infamously holds cultural artifacts and refuses to release them back to their home countries. And finally, all of these countries and NATO were together involved in the assassination of the former de facto Libyan leader Muammar Gaddafi, a controversial figure, yes, but also a pioneer of Islamic socialism and later on Pan-Africanism. His assassination resulted in the destabilization of Libya, from which it has not recovered today. Should I go on? And these aren't conspiracy theories. These are facts, okay? I Googled it, so you don't have to. The shadow that Europe casts over the rest of the world and the rise of fascism is opening many wounds. Thus, the immigration debate has been divisive enough across political lines. But this year brought some nuance that confirmed what a lot of people, myself included, believed about these biases. When Russia invaded Ukraine in February, it created an entirely new refugee crisis, with scores of Ukrainian citizens as well as foreigners residing there, being forced to flee to nearby countries or having to be evacuated by their governments. What was unique about this situation, though, and subsequently what drew international criticism, was the treatment of the Ukrainians compared to refugees from countries like Syria and Afghanistan, which I, of course, have to add, after the Taliban's takeover in 2021, also saw an increased number of Afghans seeking asylum elsewhere. Neighboring countries like Poland accepted scores of Ukrainian refugees despite refusing entry to many Syrians, Afghans, and Iraqis who had all been fleeing conflict. And it wasn't just the European leaders. The media itself was oversaturated with very blatant racism, discrimination, and prejudice about Syrian and other Middle Eastern countries and North African countries. And so many reporters were, for some reason, very comfortable making condescending comments, which you usually wouldn't hear on the news.
This isn't a place, with all due respect, like Iraq or Afghanistan, that has seen conflict raging for decades. This is a relatively civilized, relatively European, I have to choose those words carefully too, city where you wouldn't expect that or hope that it's going to happen.
These are prosperous middle-class people. These are not people trying to get away from areas in North Africa. They look like any European family that you would live next door to.
It's very emotional for me because I see European people with blue eyes and blonde hair being killed, children being killed every day with Putin's missiles.
This is not a developing third world nation. This is Europe.
Despite the shocking callousness portrayed by those journalists, those sentiments ring true for most of the migrant population in Europe, an experience that is well documented on the entertainment side as well. Dr. Ljudmila Bilkić, an assistant professor at the University of Kansas and a scholar of German migrant constructs in media, describes the phenomenon of crisis narratives that develop out of this complicated geopolitical relationship, which she argues do not account for the extensive socio-political standardization of cross-border movement in the second half of the 20th century. Bilateral agreements, the pursuit of a hierarchical identity, I have no idea how to say that word, and the supporting technological advancements signify not only a new form and frequency, but also the legitimacy of movement across officially defined borders. I know, a lot of big words there. But what she's basically saying is that migration and the concept of migration has changed significantly over the past couple of years, but consistently since the mid-20th century. However, the treatment of migrants and immigration policies themselves haven't adapted to be more cognizant of some of these changes. In essence, to normalize the process of immigration and even asylum seeking. Conflict is not something that is behind us historically, as we know, and yet that seems to not be a strong enough factor to validate some of the very natural reasons that many people have to flee their homes. I think Dr. Bilkić really draws attention to the general perception of migration and also the directional factors that influence how we think of people seeking refuge in another country. For instance, you wouldn't necessarily call an American living in Ecuador an immigrant. You might call them a tourist, an expatriate. You might call them anything but. You might not consider moving from America to Canada immigration, but it's different when we're talking about the US-Mexico border, isn't it? Yeah. Despite living in a time of more liberal values that not only tolerate but encourage things like this, we have found loopholes to give immigration a new image. This attitude is solid proof of the hostility Europeans typically meet foreigners with. So much so that one might even call it a film trope. Documentaries like Klasse Deutsch cover the process of acculturation from a child's angle, following the children of a local elementary school as they struggle to learn German and progress within the system. Another film, Mr. Gay Syria, follows the story of gay Syrian men who are seeking asylum in Turkey and competing in the Mr. Gay Syria pageant, where the winner will be able to settle in Europe. Many films of this nature are typically funded by European production companies and thrive in their festivals as they heroically share the stories of the marginalized. But they are also stark reminders of how desensitized we are to these themes, relegating them to stories that happen on the big screen and not right outside our door. Former colonizers, who have developed significantly by exploiting the labor and resources of the global south and without any desire to make amends, continue to meddle with their governments and stall their economies. They invite civil tension, stoke conflicts, and destabilize countries. And if that's not enough, they co-opt their stories in their cultural industries, profiting off of their tragedies while evading accountability at every turn. Worse still, they sensationalize these stories until they're nothing more than a headline. That is the immigration story as we know it. But before we wrap this up, let's take a look at the second page of the search results, just in case. In recent years, there have been exceptions to this otherwise homogenous display. Shows like Ramy on Hulu, whose titular character is a young Arab American man, shows a more nuanced side of this story with its heartwarming comedy that really celebrates Egyptian American culture and pushes back against stereotypical and outdated characterizations. His House, a Netflix original, takes a different approach with a supernatural horror thriller that follows a young couple fleeing conflict in Sudan but struggle to cope when they arrive in the UK with a sinister force lurking in the walls of their homes. There's obviously a wider variety in literature, with novels like Americana by Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie. And there's also Fatima Asghar's collection of poems, If They Come For Us. There are different authors like this who have had the opportunity to share their stories, and they essentially show us what could be possible if we just allow immigrants the agency and platform to share their own story. Ultimately, there's nothing simple about immigration. And despite our relationships to our home countries, our resident statuses or identities, we're all more than a story. We're more than a debate, a political platform, or even a headline. And the media should always keep in mind that it's necessary to put on a balanced story because of the influence it bears on public opinion and foreign policy as a whole. Because for many people, this is the difference between life and death. My name is Naomi, and I hope that cleared things up. Make sure you follow I Googled It so you don't have to, so you never miss an episode. Thank you for listening. Till next time.